everybody this evening to the Jacob Edwards Library. It's amazing to see so many people here just days before the holiday season begins. It's thanks to, I think, the Lenti family for really promoting the programme this evening amongst the community. There are lots of people who have grown up with, have taught, have known Joseph Lenti as a young man in this community, who has since gone on to be an assistant professor at the Eastern Washington State University. We are delighted to have Joe here this evening to present from his new book, which is Redeeming the Revolution, the State and Organized Labor in Post-Tlatelolco Mexico. This is a great opportunity for us to hear from somebody who grew up in this community, who's gone on to do some great things, and who still remembers Southbridge and comes back. And I think this is a great privilege to us to have this opportunity. So, Joe, I'm not going to belabor the start of this program. I'd like to hand it over to you, and maybe you give some biographical details as you go along. That's wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Joseph Lenti. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. It's really a pleasure to be here. I kind of spent a lot of time in this library. I grew up in Southbridge, went to Southbridge High School, and people always ask me why I care about Mexico. I'm not from a Mexican family. That's not my background. I didn't even speak Spanish until I left Massachusetts to go to graduate school in New Mexico in 2002. So it's kind of a far thing for me to be interested in something like Mexico yet. There's quite a bit about Mexico, I think, which we should all know about, considering that there isn't a more important kind of country on earth in terms of U.S. foreign relations. And this is something which is not immediately apparent to all of us because it's kind of out of our consciousness in a lot of ways. But for a lot of reasons, culturally, Mexico is absolutely the United States' most important international partner. Currently there are, or at least according in 2015, there are 35.8 million Mexicans or Mexican Americans in this country. Living in a place like Washington, I live in the Pacific Northwest, Washington State, Spokane, which is really kind of an agricultural bastion of the country. So much of what you probably ate today was grown in the Northwest. And a lot of what you ate actually too was grown in Mexico. Lettuce, tomatoes, all kinds of fruits, avocados, for example, come exclusively from Mexico. But the food that you ate in the US was probably grown by Mexicans. And when you're in the western part of the United States, you're really in a different country in a lot of ways, where you have connection, where you're in kind of what we call a resource colony, a part of the region where raw materials are produced, they're extracted, and then they're sent to sort of important regions of the country like this one. This is a metropolis, right? Much of the West is considered a periphery or a resource colony. And in places like that, you have migrant workers. You have agricultural workers, many of them with documentation, many of them without documentation. And this system is absolutely intentional. There's absolutely no, nobody is mistaken in Washington that half of the workforce is undocumented. They're there because jobs are plentiful for them, and their employers allow them to work in that situation. And without them, there is no industry. There is no agriculture. So in college, I became aware of some of these situations, and I started to realize the importance of studying a country like Mexico. I became really, close to a lot of Mexicans, having, lived in New Mexico, lived in Mexico, and this is a country that I really became fond of, culturally, historically, socially. Economically, Mexico is our #3 largest trading partner, behind only China and Canada. And for some of the reasons I mentioned, agricultural, but most of the sugar cane that's consumed in the United States comes from Mexico. A lot of oil that's consumed in the United States comes from Mexico. Many, many other things, tourist reasons. This is a major economic partner. So over time, I became very, very interested in that country, and I started to develop kind of a cultural fondness for it. And there's also some other kind of fancy terms here, I think, that factor into this book I wrote, but terms I think that are very important for us to consider when we think about some political trends in our own country today. I think we'll get to that as I walk through. But this is not going to be a discussion of the book. I think maybe if you want to learn about the book, you can buy it and read it. Honestly, I don't expect anybody to read it. It's 300 pages. It's very dense, kind of Mexican political and labor history. You know, my students haven't even read it. I would never sign it to them. My wife hasn't even read it. So, but if you really want to kind of get to sort of the bones of the book, it's all in there. I'm going to kind of give you a brief overview of it. But I really want to talk more tonight about Mexico and give a kind of general overview of that country and why I study it, you know, why I teach about it, and why I think we should all know a lot more about it. So, if you want to read this book, you have to understand what the Mexican Revolution was. Because the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1917 was arguably the most important social revolution in world history. And what that means is that it was a revolution that actually changed the way people live. And not just the leaders of the country. It wasn't just a revolution that toppled the leadership of the nation and installed new people, new leaders. It actually changed the way that peasants lived, workers lived, you know, school teachers, nurses. So in contrast to a lot of famous revolutions that you can think of, this wasn't just a substitution of elites by other groups of elites. It was a social revolution that impacted people at all levels. It was fought by men and women of the sort of bottom of society. You know, peasants or campesinos, as they're known. You know, with makeshift weapons and sombreros. This is how the revolution was fought. It was a movement that began in 1910 as an anti-re-election campaign against the dictator who had controlled the country for 36 years, but ended up being a struggle for land. Because between about 1850 to 1910, Mexican peasants lost 95% of their land. This is because with the new constitution that was passed, again, none of this is in the book, but I think it's important background. With the new constitution that was passed in 1857, there was indigenous communal lands upon which Indians lived in a kind of communal setting. That was made illegal, and the country turned itself over to private property in 1857. So within the matter of the next 50 years, what used to be sort of communal indigenous lands became haciendas, owned by owners. And indigenous peoples who used to live on those lands and kind of, you know, take part in communal harvests became peons, or landless laborers working for wages. And that's what led to the revolution of 1910. A revolution which would ultimately kill a quarter of the country. Mexico had about 8 million people in 1910. By about 1917, it has 6. So many were killed in battle. Many died of, war creates all kinds of other effects like, you know, crop failures, dislocation, diseases. So it takes the lives of many in the country, but it does kind of create the basis for a new nation to be born with very different ideals, where, you know, peasants all of a sudden have a say in society for the first time ever. So some of the kind of famous figures of the revolution. Francisco Madero, he was a very, very wealthy landowner in the north who challenged the Mexican dictator. He challenged him, and of course, you know, when he's about to win the election, he's thrown in prison. He escapes, and in exile, he basically writes a declaration calling for the Mexican people to rise up and revolt, to overthrow the Mexican dictator. Porfirio Diaz is his name. So he's kind of the father of the revolution, but he very much represents a sort of landed, powerful elites, the hacienda owners of the country. So he never imagined the kind of social movement he would ignite by this political challenge. In the revolution, we kind of associate with men like this. This is Francisco Villa, Pancho Villa. He was, you know, a cattle rustler. He was, at one point, he was a carnicero. He was a butcher. He did all kinds of things. He was an excellent horseman. He worked on haciendas as a wrangler. But it's precisely someone like Villa, it's precisely someone like Zapata, who kind of represent the interests of the people, whether they're ranchers, whether they're cowboys, whether they're peasants. And these are the people who kind of seized control of the movement after Madero was assassinated in 1913. And this is when the revolution gets kind of really crazy. It's when the kind of popular elements of society, like the peasants, like the miners, like the school teachers, get involved and start to push for real social change. So some of you probably know Mexican Revolution from, you know, movies, books. It was a time of, you know, chaos, big sombrero hats, peasant fighters like this. But it's going to create a nation which, you know, by Latin American standards, is the most stable, the most the most modern and the most progressive in all of 20th century Latin America. You know, when we think about this, think about how Mexico, born from the revolution, becomes a country which is actually successful in the course of the 20th century, the political kind of model for the rest of the developing world. But we'll get to that. So again, if you really want to kind of punish yourself with this book, you need to kind of think about the country that is born after 1917 and how it's composed. So you have, after 1917, you still have a country which has a democratic process where people go to the polls and they elect leaders. But it's not going to be a real democracy. It's still going to be a democracy that's dominated by the kind of leaders of the movement. And we call this a party state. A party state is a government where the ruling party and the government are indistinguishable. Nobody inside the government represents a different political party. They're appointed by the political leaders. Mexico has this really, still to this day, has this really kind of strange revolutionary concept that says you can only serve one term in office, in any position, whether you're a mayor, whether you're a governor, whether you're the president. And that was because, prior to the revolution, they had a president who served 11 terms. So they said one of the most revolutionary principles is no re-election. And this was meant to create turnover. What that does, though, in a country like this, is that it creates this kind of shuffling system where everyone knows they're going to serve one term, and maybe they want to go on to some other political office. They're going to have to be incredibly loyal to their leader so that they can be appointed to something different when their term ends. And in a lot of cases, maybe they want to just simply get out of politics, so they're going to use their time in office to simply sacar, to loot. So the last kind of year of any politician's term in office is called el saqueo, the looting. And this is when kind of politicians are going to kind of use their time to get what they can get because they know they're never going to have to hold office. So because politicians in Mexico are not accountable to re-election, they basically have no responsibility to their constituents. So in the 20th century in Mexico, you would have had a single party. This is called the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. This would have been the one party that controlled Mexican politics from pretty much from 1917 all the way until it was voted out of power in 2000. It's since come back. And the party is divided into three sectors. And these are the sectors of the revolution. The peasant sector, right? Those would have been, let's see, those who would have followed Zapata, those whose primary responsibility or primary desire is for land. They want access to land. And throughout the 20th century, the Mexican government distributes land. It breaks up the haciendas that are owned by, Mexican landowners, American landowners. There were British landowners, there were Spaniards. It simply takes the land away from them. The Mexican Revolution says that you can only own land up to a certain point. And if you do, the rest of it will be expropriated from you. And it will be redistributed to the peasants who probably lost their land in the 19th century because of this kind of political reform. And it's very easy to deprive peasants of land. Maybe the government created a law that said you had to have a deed. These people would have had land that they had in their families for centuries. They weren't literate. They didn't have any kinds of deeds. All of a sudden, they can't show their deed to the Mexican officials. They lose their land on some kind of legal technicality. So this is how people are dispossessed of land in the days prior to the revolution. So the Mexican Revolution wants to redistribute land to peasants. And it creates kind of this system where, there's a very, very important saying in Mexico. You see it in other parts of Latin America, but it's absolutely the words of Zapata, which says, "La tierra es de quien la trabaja." The land belongs to those who work it. And this is an ancient kind of indigenous concept, which means that if you don't work the land, it's not yours. So the idea of an absentee landowner owns it and has people work for him in exchange for a wage is simply kind of impossible to accept by most indigenous peoples. So the Mexican Revolution begins to restore that in a way which is admirable, although flawed and filled with lots of problems. So this party has a lot of kind of noble basis to it, but it's ultimately there's a lot of shortcomings too. My book actually focuses on this sector, the worker sector. And after the Mexican Revolution, Mexican workers who had been exploited, working in workshops, getting paid nothing, miners, for example, working in Sonora or working in places like Chihuahua, they would have worked for U.S.-owned mines. These guys would have been simply disposable. If they get hurt on the job, oh well. There's plenty of Mexicans who would love to have that position, who could take their job. If they get maimed, if they lose an arm, it doesn't really mean anything to the bosses. They'll simply replace them with this kind of growing supply of landless laborers who need jobs. So workers had gripes in the revolution, and they fought to kind of overthrow the ownership, the owners in their country who dominated industries. And so many of those owners too, in fact, were foreign, that was a major cause of the revolution. It was a nationalistic kind of cause against foreign ownership of Mexican resources. So I really focus on workers. What do I focus on specifically? So the workers' movement is key to understanding what is discussed in this book. So in the 1930s, this was the Great Depression worldwide, right? In Mexico, like the United States, undergoes an economic decline. And you have to imagine that the United States, by the 1930s, was the world's most important economy, by far. And most importantly, it's the greatest importer of goods. So, when economic chaos hits the US, people lose their savings, they lose their homes. They simply don't have the sort of discretionary income they used to have to buy things like coffee. They don't buy things like sugar. They certainly don't buy things like bananas. And that's what Mexico produces, right? So all of a sudden, when US demand for these products goes down because of economic chaos at home, Latin American economies go into the tank as well. Just a couple years into the Depression, by 1931, 1932, Mexico had reduced its exports to the US by 75%. So economic chaos is the norm here in a place like Mexico, which depends on sending its goods to the United States for purpose. Interestingly though, in Mexico, this is exactly the moment when the government can actually carry out the promises of the revolution by doing things like distributing land and putting into place worker protections, which people had fought for and died for in the 19-teens. So this is Lázaro Cárdenas, who is, he's like the FDR of Mexico. And he's the only kind of political figure I think you can find in the country who's universally loved. And that's saying a lot because, politicians are not highly regarded in Mexico. If you think cynicism in the United States about politics is bad, go to Mexico. They hate their leaders, and they hate their government. And they really don't have any reason to trust them or admire them because of the ways that corruption has been sort of ingrained into the Mexican politics going back to Spanish colonial times. But at least in the 1930s, there was a moment when workers had an ally. And Cárdenas kind of wins the allegiance of peasants by actually distributing land in huge amounts. But he's also on the side of the Mexican unions, who are very fierce, very, very active, but have never had an ally in government. And every time they kind of go to battle with their owners, with their employers, the government always sides on the interests of the ownership. But Cárdenas, he steps in on huge strikes that occur in the 1930s. Oil workers, for example, they strike against their British and American-owned employers. Cárdenas steps in, he kind of rules in their favor. Glass workers in a place like Monterrey, beer workers, they strike against their employers. Cárdenas steps in. And they form an organization called the Confederation of Mexican Workers, the CTM. And it's going to be these guys here. And these guys are all from the working class. Most importantly in this kind of picture is somebody named Fidel Velázquez, this guy here. He was born in 1900. He was born on a farm outside of Mexico City, in the state of Mexico. His father was killed in the revolutionary fighting when the Revolutionary Army under Zapata kind of invaded the ranch. And then by the time he's about 13, 14, he's working in Mexico City as a milkman. He's delivering milk. So he comes from kind of working class origins. And he's one of the first leaders of this organization here. Not the first, but the second. And he's going to control that organization from 1943 until his death in 1997. And he's going to become kind of the face of the workers' movement. And everything I discuss in my book is kind of happening during his lifetime and his rule. And he's, he has working class origins, but he gets kind of embroiled in the kind of political chaos and corruption of the 20th century state. So that by the time by the time the events I describe in my book happens, he's really seen as a sort of enemy of the working class, a stooge of the government, even a stooge of the employers, who he argues so passionately against in all of his rhetoric. Also fun is to consider that the first event that happens in my book that kind of sets the stage for what I discuss happens in a place called Tlatelolco, which is going to be kind of takes some practice to say, right? So, Mexico, it's an ancient civilization, as old as any major civilizations on Earth. You would have had Olmec, Maya peoples, kind of with sophisticated farming, sophisticated cities, at work 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. Where Mexico City is currently located today, though, is actually quite new. Nobody lived there at all until a group called the Nahuas, or the Mexica, as they call themselves. So they migrated into this region in the year 1325. So Mexican civilization is much, much older than that. You find cities all over the place. But what we're looking at right here is only founded in 1325. And this was founded because it was a swampy marshland that nobody wanted to live on. The Mexica people had been driven out of their homeland through war. They came from the north. They battled a group called Toltec. And they were pushed into this kind of swampy, mosquito-infested marshland where they could finally kind of live a life. And they were kind of outcasts in Mexican society at that point. And they settled in this kind of like this marshy area here with these kind of with these really kind of I hesitate to even call this land because it's kind of like a swamp, and there's water and it's there's water sources coming up from all areas, but again this was so unattractive that nobody wanted to live here. But when they finally settled down here in 1325, they begin to build the greatest city the Americas had ever seen. That city is divided in half. In the eastern half is called Tlatelolco, which means navel of the moon in the language of the Aztecs, Nahuatl. So what we're looking at here is, this is kind of central ceremonial area here. Aztecs, by the way, was a term given to these people by the Spanish conquerors, who, this was not a term they've ever used or ever identified with, but it was a term applied by the Spanish invaders in 1519. They called themselves Mexica, the word from which we get Mexico, Mexica. This kind of part of the picture was an area called Tenochtitlan, which means place of the prickly pear cactus. Tenochtitlan. And that's exactly what the Mexica said. They were migrated from the north. They were guided by their warrior god, the god of the sun, the god of war. His name was, anyone write this down? His name was Huitzilopochtli, which means brandished firebrand. Okay, so they march in and they see this kind of sign which tells them that that their migration should end. They see an eagle perched atop a cactus devouring a serpent, which is the current flag of Mexico. And they build their city here in this area because of that omen. But very quickly, a kind of a rival city develops just over here. And we're not talking about a huge area here. This is basically an area the size of a college campus. But we had two fiercely independent, fiercely kind of rival cities that battled for hundreds of years before the people of the north, the Tenochtitlan people, conquered those in the south. But down here you would have had a city which for a good 150 years was pretty much the most happening place in the Western Hemisphere. Here you would have had a marketplace that was famous across the entire Americas. So the marketplace of Tlatelolco was a place where traders would have come all the way from the Rio Grande Valley. Maybe you would have had Hopi or Navajo people kind of coming down all the way into central Mexico to trade goods. There they could have obtained really interesting things that you can't get where they lived, like red macaw feathers. That was a luxury item of the time. All kinds of different shells, abalone, cowrie shells that would have been very, very valuable. They would have these Rio Grande peoples would have traded their turquoise in exchange for Central American goods. The Aztecs, you probably know, maybe you've learned about this. They had a taste for human flesh. It was absolutely a status symbol to consume human flesh, and that was, you could have bought a basket of human meat in Tlatelolco. Yeah, that's going to become a major problem when the Spanish get there, because that's going to be one of the reasons why the Spanish are like ridiculously mean to the Aztecs. Was this kind of the prominence of human sacrifice in cannibalism. So that's a thing. That's a problem. But this was a city that would have made any city in Europe look like a cesspool. The indigenous peoples were incredibly clean. They had all of their waste removed by boats and canoes that would have kind of simply taken it outside of the city. All human waste was removed so that it could be used to fertilize fields outside the city. There was an entire civil service in the Aztec world. Men simply their job was simply to kind of plaster all these buildings with this kind of lime plaster so that it shined, so that it was clean. So when the Spanish looked upon this city, from this angle actually, in 1519, they were stunned at how it kind of glistened in the sun, how clean it was, how orderly it was. Most peoples inside these cities worked for the government. They worked as sanitation workers. They worked as street sweepers. They worked as laborers. They removed sewage from the city. This is in great contrast to the Spanish cities, which were disgusting cesspools of human waste, filth. Raw sewage kind of ran through the streets of all major cities, Seville, Madrid, what have you. So there's a lot going on here which is admirable. But because of the prominence of things like human sacrifice, this was deemed as a diabolical place. It was a place that the Spaniards were committed to destroying because of this kind of misunderstanding of indigenous religion. Now this, again, none of this is in the book. Simply Tlatelolco is because that's the place I'm discussing. But the Tlatelolco I discuss has nothing to do with this. This is the city that will eventually be conquered by the Spanish in 1521. In fact, it's here, in the marketplace of Tlatelolco, where the final decisive battle happens. Here, the forces of Hernan Cortez defeat the last Aztec king. His name is Cuauhtemoc. They defeat him there, drive him from the city, eventually execute him. But this was the capital of the Aztec Empire, and when it falls in 1521, it opens the door for Spanish conquest of Mexico. Much more important to kind of discuss in the book is what happens in 1968, also in Tlatelolco, right? So the 1960s in Mexico, like elsewhere, you have a student movement worldwide which is pursuing some pretty similar goals. Like students in places like France, Paris, Prague, Chicago, Mexican students are pushing for things like political rights. Mexican students want to see increased democracy in their country. They in particular want to see the voting age reduced from 21 to 18. That's a kind of major cause of the Mexican student movement. But Mexican students, unlike others, are really interested in kind of maintaining a promise of the revolution that had been very, very important since 1917. In Mexico, the government is prohibited from ever stepping foot on a college campus. Colleges in Mexico have autonomy. They're allowed to operate completely free of the government. They're fully funded by the government. You might know that college in Mexico is entirely free. There's no tuition. Anybody who can pass these rigorous entrance exams can go to college absolutely free. And then once they're there, they can be sure that they're not going to have any kind of censored curriculum that the government has a hand in. So more and more over the course of the 20th century, the government started to intervene in the university, and it started to dictate what the universities were teaching in a way which completely defied the promises of the revolution. So Mexican students are saying, we want the government off our campuses, we want to go back to this university autonomy, they call it. Now, the backdrop for all of this is that in 1968, Mexico was hosting the Olympics. And this is because by 1968, Mexico was seen as the most advanced, most affluent, and most progressive of all the developing world. So it was kind of a model for the rest of the developing world, third world, developing world, what have you. It was a country that had come a long way in just 45 years since the revolution. It had created an industry which rivaled, any industry you'd see anywhere in the third world. It had political peace because of the creation of this kind of party state, which was a dictatorship, yes, but it had the kind of workings of democracy. So the Olympic Committee decided that they wanted to showcase Mexico as a model for other countries to emulate. Countries like Brazil, countries like India, third world countries with big economies that could become like Mexico. So the government of Mexico is really keen on portraying this image of stability, progress, and peace to the outside world. But the students demand that the government kind of fix some things before the Olympics come. So they're really kind of testing the government here on the on the eve of the Olympics. So all throughout 1968 in the summer, you would have seen, basically battles between student demonstrators and the army and the Mexico City police. Things really kind of come to a head on October 2nd, 1968. The Olympics are set to, they're scheduled to begin on October 12th. On October 2nd, there is a demonstration in this kind of, nondescript plaza in Mexico City. The Plaza of the Three Cultures, they call it. It's in the neighborhood of Tlatelolco. And this was a plaza where you would have had, in these buildings, you would have had government workers, middle-class workers who kind of lived here. These were people who had benefited from the revolution. These would have been workers or peasants prior to 1917 and wouldn't have had any opportunities. Because of the revolution, they become middle-class bureaucrats. These are the ones who send their kids to college. So they have a lot invested in sort of this government, this nation. But their children are the ones who are sort of demanding social change. And they hold a demonstration on October 2, which is like a lot of demonstrations that would have preceded this. Well, by this point, the government, just 10 days away from the Olympics, decides that it has to deal with this kind of movement very, very severely. So there's a speech going on at about 5 p.m., and all of a sudden, flares kind of are shot up in the back of the plaza. The Olympic battalion, which was organized by the government, is there. They're always kind of patrolling the streets to make sure that these protests don't get out of hand. But they fire off flares, and instantly shots are fired. And they're fired from these buildings here, specifically the third floor of this building. It's called the Chihuahua building. And people start dying. So snipers kind of, in these buildings, start kind of popping off shots at the demonstrators. And of course, all hell breaks loose. The demonstrators are none, maybe a few, but evidence says that virtually none of them are armed. But there is a kind of conflict that results that sees something like 350 people killed at the end of the day. And the fighting goes on through the night. In fact, there's even gun battles inside the government buildings. Grenades are exploded, but the blood count, the body count is atrocious. And it absolutely kind of threatens to destroy this kind of image of peace and prosperity in Mexico right on the eve of the Olympics. This guy here is Luis Echeverria. He was the Secretary of Internal Affairs in 1968, which means he was in charge of internal security of the country and the electoral system. So it's a very important job. And most Mexican presidents have been in this job before they become the president. So he's the one who's kind of in charge of keeping domestic security and tranquility in his country. He's the one who organized the Olympic battalion, the one that eventually kind of opens fire on these demonstrators and kills hundreds of them on October 2. So he becomes a sort of enemy of the Mexican left, but the student population most of all. And they despise him. They call him a murderer. He's never going to kind of live down the Massacre of Tlatelolco. So images from 1968 are pretty known to us. This was the Olympics of this, for example. Does anyone know what this picture is?
I do.
What's that?
They called it Black Power.
Yeah, yeah. That's Tommy Smith, John Carlos. They win the gold and silver. I think that's the 100-meter sprint. I always feel bad for this guy. He's just kind of like in the picture, but nobody knows who he is. I actually know his name is Peter Norman. He's Australian, and over the years he would become a very kind of vocal supporter of the Black Power movement in the U.S. But nobody ever, he's not even listed in this little caption here. But this was the Olympics of social movements worldwide, and it happens in Mexico. In Mexico, nobody's fooled. The country, by this point, is referred to widely as the perfect dictatorship. The perfect dictatorship. It has all of this kind of structures of democracy. People go to the polls, they elect politicians, but they elect politicians from a single party. And if there's ever any possibility that somebody might not get elected that the government prefers, they'll get elected. There's all kinds of electoral techniques that can be used to guarantee that the PRI stays in power and that its politicians remain in control. So Mexican students are calling out the sort of failures of the Mexican government. And '68 was a time when the world became attuned to this. So, no worries. Yeah, I'm a teacher, believe me, this happens about 3 times. It's never not going to happen. The government, even has this sort of audacity to call this the Olympiad of Peace. Just 10 days after the carnage of Tlatelolco. Okay, so if you know this background, you can kind of understand what's happening in my book. Basically, I talk about how the government has to restore its image as a revolutionary force, as a force of good, after the Massacre of Tlatelolco. The Massacre of Tlatelolco had nothing to do with workers. Students are a part of a different social sector. They're part of this professional sector. Yet, the government is really concerned. This is the government of Echeverria, for example. He feels that if the workers lose faith in the revolutionary government, if they go on strike, if they block, plazas, if they, shut down petroleum mills, sugar mills, petroleum plants, then we have a real problem. We can put up with some whiny college students because they don't really threaten the stability of the government. But workers, on the other hand, are very, very dangerous. So we have to appease them. And they've been striking at record levels since the 1950s because they too see some of the kind of hypocrisies of the revolution. But so the Massacre of Tlatelolco murders college students. It has very little to do with workers who have very little sympathy for students, right? Even to this day in our own country, we can imagine how the typical coal worker doesn't really have a whole lot of sympathy for the issues of college campuses. I know this, right? I work on a college campus, and I know that what happens on a college campus is a bubble that doesn't have a lot of. It's not really that important to many in the working class, particularly those in the industrial working class. Echeverria knows this, and he himself comes from the professional class. He went to the National University. He was a law professor. He doesn't have a worker's background, but he's going to become the #1 kind of advocate for the working class, even though nothing about his background, his education, his wealth has anything to do with them. But he becomes a very effective kind of populist, a very effective advocate for the interests of the masses in order to kind of maintain political power and stability. We talked about him. This is Lázaro Cárdenas. He was the one who sort of, created the unions in Mexico. He was the one who distributed the land. And he's still alive in 1968. He's horrified by what's happening in this country. And redeeming the revolution means that we have to imagine that this is, the concept of redemption is a religious concept that comes from the early days of Catholicism. In the Roman Empire, you would redeem someone by purchasing their freedom and freeing them from slavery. That's what the word technically means. Liberating someone from slavery by purchasing their freedom. And in Latin America, the concept of redemption is crucial. You can be redeemed from sin. You can be redeemed from dishonor. You can be redeemed from murder. By doing by carrying out this sort of quasi-religious process of redemption. And many Latin American leaders have kind of advertised themselves as redeemers, saviors. Those who are going to save their people from sin, from dictatorship, from murder. So Cárdenas becomes an important image for the government to sort of use in the 1960s to save itself from this kind of this disaster of Tlatelolco. Someone like Echeverria, for example, he wants to connect himself to the revolution at any moment he can. He attends funerals of the guys who signed the Constitution. He serves as pallbearers. When Cárdenas dies in 1970, he's there to give a big speech. The goal is to kind of portray himself as the inheritor of Cárdenas, like the guy who's going to follow through with Cárdenas' promises. The workers love Cárdenas. They don't really love Echeverria, but he wants to change that through his rhetoric of redemption. So workers, right? These guys would have been electrical workers. They would have been railroad workers, oil workers, milkmen, taxi drivers. They become crucial to the government. The government which says over and over again, we're glad we have a middle class, we're glad students go to college in this country, but those aren't the real Mexicans. The real Mexicans are the workers. The kids that go to college, these are the ones at this point in 1970, you can imagine they had long hair, they smoked joints, they listened to, the Rolling Stones. All of a sudden they're portrayed as bad Mexicans, and that's a term used over and over again, because they're not the real children of Mexico. These are the real people of Mexico, right? They don't listen to the Rolling Stones, they listen to Vicente Fernandez. They listen to mariachi, right? they don't smoke marijuana, they drink tequila. I mean, this is like the real Mexico here. And the government is going to ally itself with the masses. In turn, the kind of intellectuals and the students into enemies of the government. They cast them as, weak, gullible, irreverent is the word. They don't respect their elders. That's the word they use constantly. They're bad Mexicans. They call them effeminate because they have long hair and they have funny-looking clothes. So the government wants to kind of side with the workers over the students. This is a very important kind of means to redeem the government in the eyes of the state. But by this point too, you also have a Mexican business class which is regaining power. And even while the government claims to be an ally of the working class and an ally of the revolution, it's doing things that suggest that it's starting to kind of undo some of the gains of the revolution. This was the age of something called the maquiladoras. These are foreign-owned companies that operate in Mexico, typically along the border, and they're basically light assembly plants. So this is where stuff that's produced in the United States arrives to Mexico to be assembled into finished products and then sold again. So it's kind of light industry. And under Echeverria, the maquiladoras appear in Mexico, and they start to operate, and they're disasters for workers. They provide low-wage jobs, but they don't have any of the worker protections that the revolution promised these people. So you start to see kind of this alliance with the business class, which had disappeared with the revolution, come back. Nevertheless, union newspapers, literature always kind of argues how the government is there to protect the worker against the evil business owners, the patrones, right? I'm going to kind of skim through some of this because we're already short on time here. But the point is the government's playing a very, very complicated game. It's arguing in the newspapers, in speeches, that it's an ally of the worker, an enemy of the student, again, which is a very popular line amongst workers. Meanwhile, it's kind of negotiating with business people in a way which kind of opens the door for the return of this kind of pre-revolutionary business exploitation of workers, which workers had fought and died for in 1917. This is a period of immense union activity, lots of strikes, lots of petitions for strikes, constant negotiations between employers and workers. But in almost every case, the businesses win, the workers lose. In Mexico, you can't go on strike unless it's approved by the government. And even though workers are going on strike at record levels here, believing that their government, believing that Echeverria supports them because of his speeches, his government is basically rejecting their strike petitions at record rates. In fact, in the 1970s, something like less than 0.5% of all strike petitions are approved by the government, even though unions believe the government is on their side because of this very effective rhetoric it's using. So workers are starting to kind of get irritated that, the words of the government don't seem to be reality, and more they're becoming frustrated. Here again, this is Fidel Velázquez, the perpetual leader of the CTM. It's a labor confederation controlled by the government. It doesn't operate independently at all from the state. It's the official labor union, but it's under the control of the government. Here's Luis Echeverria. Two guys hate each other. I talk a lot about that. But at least in public, in the workers' press, they were best friends. Mexican presidents need the support of the CTM if they actually want to, if they want the nomination, they need the support of this kind of powerful union. But once in power, Echeverria really begins to kind of take off Velázquez through all kinds of things, like freeing political prisoners from the 60s, freeing striking imprisoned union leaders who had kind of challenged Echeverria from the old days. So he has some kind of measures that bother the old union boss. But at the end of the day, the two are very effective allies, even though there's personal problems. Mexican workers begin to kind of protest the hypocrisy of the government and the hypocrisy of their unions. This here is a kind of quintessentially Mexican concept. Charismo. What that means is a charo is basically the owner of a hacienda. And if you ever see mariachi, they wear costumes called charo costumes. The hat, the suit. This is meant to harken back to sort of the glory days of the 19th century hacienda, when you had a nobleman on horseback, kind of leading his ranch. He dressed very well. He was the best horseman. Probably was the best singer. You know, he probably was a known ladies' man. He was kind of the man's man in Mexico, and he looked the part. By the 20th century, corrupt union bosses are called charros because they kind of run their unions like the hacienda owners ran their haciendas in the days. And there was even a couple of them who wore the charro costume to kind of embrace this role. They're corrupt, they're on the government payroll, they're going to do what the government says, they're going to kind of, you know, repress any kind of union activity which the government disagrees with. And this is kind of how the labor relations play out in Mexico at this time. Here, these are electrical workers who don't belong to a state-sanctioned union. They're saying, death to union charismo, death to syndical charismo. We support the students. So this is a kind of very kind of anti-government message here that you would have seen more and more at this time. And this is a story which still continues to this day in Mexico. In 1969, for example, you would have seen electrical workers who don't belong to a state-sanctioned union hoisting a sign that says, "Private initiative is reactionary and fascist." These were people who want the government to kind of follow through with its revolutionary promises, which means that the electrical industry, the oil industry, the railroads, the telecommunications lines, these are owned by the government. So Mexico, after the revolution, is a quasi-socialist nation. So they believe that private industry at all itself is anti-revolutionary. It's fascist. This is a picture I took in 2013 in the same spot this one would have been taken. Here, electrical workers from the same union are protesting the privatization of the industry, the electrical industry. They call it for the renationalization of the electrical sector and the oil sector, which is now partially owned. Mexico's oil industry has been finally privatized after 70 years. It's now under private ownership. No to privatization. So the same stories are being played out over and over again in Mexico to this day. The same rhetoric you would have heard 50 years ago, 70 years ago, 80 years ago actually. So, I'm going to wrap this up. So, this summer I gave a talk on this book in Mexico City. And I spoke a lot about the book because I don't have to educate Mexicans on the revolution. they know plenty about that. It's something that it's the most important part of it's the basis of their modern nation. So everybody knows who Pancho Villa is, Lázaro Cárdenas, Zapata, what have you. And in the audience was a guy who was formerly the Deputy Attorney General of the country. And he was close friends with, well, the man who arranged the talk for me was the former Attorney General. This was his former employee. And he's very close, the Deputy Attorney General is very close with the Echeverria family. So he said, after the talk, he's like, "Would you like to meet him?" And this was not something that I ever thought was realistic. Because since 2006, Echeverria, he was tried for genocide in 2006. The Mexican courts determined that the statute of limitations had run out. He couldn't be tried. So he's lived in kind of this self-imposed exile in his home in Mexico City since then. So the moment I started researching this book in 2007, he's already kind of like, the worst guy in the country. Everyone hates him. He lives in this kind of infamy in his home. He's never seen in public. So I didn't think it was reasonable to send a interview request to him, even though he's the most important figure in my book. So just a few hours after giving this talk, I found myself in his home. And it's amazing. Yeah. Just a couple days before that, there was a huge protest in front of their house. They burned him in effigy. Everyone hates this guy's guts. Like really, he's not a beloved figure. So I enter his house and there's his daughter who greets me. And on their wall is this giant photo here. This giant photo of this is Echeverria and his wife Maria Esther. And she, in contrast to her husband, is actually beloved. People love her. She was incredibly vocal as a feminist. She was calling for kind of women's rights in Mexico at a time when that was laughable. And both the president and the first lady, as part of their kind of populist, strategy, they like to dress like traditional Mexicans, which is saying a lot in the 1960s and 70s because, Echeverria takes over a country where, the state functions, people dress in tuxedos, they drink martinis and whiskeys. They kind of want, the goal here in the third world at the time is to appear sophisticated, appear cosmopolitan. Echeverria said, nope, we're gonna entertain people with traditional Mexican foods, music, foods and liquors. So he replaces, filet mignon with tamales. He's drinking tequila instead of whiskey. He's doing all these things that Mexican people can relate to. And they wear the clothes of kind of Mexican country people. This is a shirt that Echeverria constantly wore called the Guayabera. Guayabera, you've seen it with lots of pockets, right? It's the dress of the Mexican plantation worker. This is a first lady. She's wearing a dress that would have come directly out of the closet of Frida Kahlo, for example. This is a Tijuana costume from southern Mexico. And this is how the couple dressed in a way which is very, very effective at winning them some kind of support from the Mexican masses. Again, the students and the intellectuals hated them, but the great majority of Mexicans were fond of the presidential couple. So when the daughter, they had 8 children, she was like the third of 8. When I showed her the picture in the book that's hanging in their wall, this kind of opened up some doors for me. They gave me this incredible kind of afternoon in their home. So I meet the president. He's 95. He's not mobile anymore. He can't get up. But he asked me what the book is about. And this is the moment I kind of dreaded, because what am I going to do? Tell him how he killed all these people and then he had to restore his image with the Mexican people by claiming to be a supporter of the working classes. So in my host, the 2 guys who brought me there were like really worried about what I was going to say, because I mean he's well past the point of sort of debating why what he did was okay or was wrong. So I basically told him that he studies how he restored the relationship with the unions after 1968, which is more or less what the book does. But it was an incredible kind of once-in-a-lifetime experience. But it's an experience that could actually cost me a lot of credibility in Mexico. There are people there who would despise me for even kind of sitting down and shaking the hands of somebody who they consider one of the biggest villains in Mexican history. But as a historian, you don't really, I'm not a journalist. I'm not there to sort of expose to the world what Echeverria tells me. But next time I write about him, I might have some kind of insight. What I did see was that in his home, all of the kind of aesthetic populism, the images, the clothes, the food, all that stuff which I talked about in the book is kind of snarky. I mean, that's actually what he likes to wear. That's what they like to drink. He sleeps in this tiny little twin-sized bed under a giant painting of the Virgin of Guadalupe. You can't get more Mexican than that. So, I mean, he wasn't playing in that regard. He was absolutely that was his style. That was what fascinated him. So I did learn some of those things. But again, it's a very kind of dicey political thing to meet Echeverria and then live to tell about it in Mexico. It was surreal. Oops. I know we're out of time here, but I just as a sort of another kind of classic populist line at the time, what had been Echeverria was his entire time in office he was angling to become Secretary of the United Nations, Secretary General of the UN. That's what he wanted to do, because he believed that he was the sort of most important voice for the third world. He had this kind of very powerful anti-imperialist, anti-Yankee, anti-American kind of line. And Latin Americans can relate to that. There's not a lot of love for the United States in Latin America, a country which has invaded Latin American countries on 4 dozen occasions since 1898. I say nothing of the invasion of Mexico in 1846, which cost Mexico half its nation. So Latinos look at Americans largely as imperialists who don't respect their sovereignty. And history really endorses that. It's true. We don't. Never have. So Echeverria is going to kind of try to become sort of the ally of the third world, ally of Latin America by becoming friendly with its most important leaders. And there's no greater redeemer in Latin American history than Fidel Castro. He's like the arch redeemer, right? So for Echeverria to claim that this is I'm going to be on an equal footing with Castro is a thing that this wins him great support from the Mexican, from the masses, from the workers, even from the leftist intellectuals who could look past Tlatelolco. Now, I guess I'm going to wrap this up because all of this kind of government which I'm describing here arguably is making an appearance in this country. Populism is a sort of strategy of pandering to the masses. class war, right? I'm going to sort of ally with one class over the other. Well, because that's it. They're numerically more popular. They have more votes. So I'm going to claim to kind of, I'm going to claim to be their allies, in contrast to another group. Echeverria does this by claiming to be, in the best interest of workers, because they're the ones who can destabilize the country through strikes. They're the ones who can keep them in power through elections. There's many, many more workers than there are students, so that's going to be my political base. Populism also has a kind of cynical connotation, which means that you're doing all this stuff, but you don't really actually want to do it. You still want to kind of maintain the status quo while winning the votes of people who you claim to represent. Clientelism. Again, this is the most kind of Latin concept imaginable. And I don't mean Latin America, I mean going back to Roman times, right? Clientelism, when you had powerful patrons and you had powerful clients. And patrons and clients owed each other allegiances, but ultimately the clients obeyed the patrons and the patrons returned patronage to them in response. In Mexico is a sort of classic clientelist state where leaders are more important than institutions. So many are arguing that in the United States we're kind of moving toward the Latin Americanization of politics. Even before Trump was elected, they called him American Caudillo, which means that he kind of acts he behaves and acts as a leader in the style of a Latin American caudillo, the gentleman on horseback who controlled his ranches, controlled his lands, and was a kind of the most powerful force of life. He is much more powerful than the institution. If the institution has to be destroyed so that he can survive, and his clients get their reward, so be it. Caudillos in Latin America were famous for their charisma. They were famous because they were beloved by the people they provided for. In Latin America, we could talk about lots of caudillos who are famous to us. This is General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. You know him. He was president of Mexico on 11 separate occasions. Constantly dismantling the country when the Congress opposed him. Retaking the country in a kind of march on Mexico City when necessary. He was president during the Mexican-American War, leading to the sort of loss of half of Mexico's territory. So a powerful caudillo, beloved by his people, but terrible for his nation as a whole. This is Rafael Trujillo. He was a dictator in the Dominican Republic during the 1930s. Another kind of classic caudillo. Always disbanding the Congress when it disagreed with him, claiming to represent the Dominican people. And he comes from the Dominican masses. He was somebody who had this kind of healthy hatred of the elite because they looked down upon him for his skin color, for his kind of lack of education. So he kind of is an excellent populist who has the support of the people by giving them what they want along class lines while destroying the country. You might know these two. That's Juan Perón, president of Argentina. He was a pretty good populist, but his wife was even better. She was an even better populist. Evita Perón came from the Argentine masses. She was basically homeless when she migrated to Buenos Aires in the 1920s. She's beautiful, but she becomes a radio actress. But together, these two kind of they form a relationship that look with the working classes much like Echeverria does. She's always talking about the oligarchs and the business owners as enemies of the people, as bad Argentines. She talked about the las señoras gordas, the fat ladies. These are the kind of wealthy elites who always kind of crushed the interests of the working classes. So there's a long history of populism in Latin America in caudillo rule. And you see it in Mexico, in the town I study, and arguably you've seen a kind of rise of caudillos today in places that aren't Latin America, right? So, interesting kind of possible connections to contemporary stuff. I think I'm going to break there. Do we have any time for questions? All right.
Joe, have you actually had any, when you met the gentleman who was not well liked, have you actually had any issues, problems with that, or?
Not yet, no. I haven't been back to Mexico since. And if I were to give this talk in Mexico, I would not mention that.
Really?
Because you're going to have people in the crowd to say, he murdered my brother. He murdered my uncle. There's nobody more associated with the Massacre of Tlatelolco than Echeverria. So I would have to kind of be, if I were to present this at a university, he's, in the United States we talk about Kent State, which was, 1971? It was a massacre of students by the National Guard. This was a massacre of students 100 times at that level. And it was very, very, it was very painful. So no, I haven't had that. There's also a lot of U.S. academics who would be, you know, they would be disgusted by this. They would claim, but at the same time, as I mentioned, I'm not a reporter. I'm not a journalist. I'm not there to sort of expose the secrets of Echeverria. So as a historian, you can't not speak to the subject of your history. There's really, you don't have a choice. And I'm not there to pass any moral judgment on him. I want to understand the past. Yeah, you know.
Joe, as Zapata and Villa, how would you rate him as a revolution? Would you say that he was a revolution? Or?
Yeah, he's let's see here. He's talking about. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah, they were true revolutionaries. Both of them had the country in their hands at one point, and they chose not to rule. And that's pretty interesting, because there was a moment in 1915 when Villa's army kind of marched from the north, and took Mexico City. Zapata's armies marched from the south and took Mexico City. They met in the city, and the leadership had been gone. The federal army had been defeated, but neither of them wanted to rule the country, because, you know, for the peasant mindset of the 19-teens, they simply didn't see themselves as presidential material. They had this kind of deep-seated inferiority, believing that they were hardly literate. They were men of the people. So they wanted to prepare the way for somebody who was more qualified to rule, even though they controlled the most powerful armies in the country. So the fact that they had power in their hands and they gave it up is interesting, but it kind of suggests that they had kind of a noble vision for what they wanted to do with the country, and it wasn't just, they weren't just power hungry.
What's the average Mexican with
yeah, they're both kind of folk heroes. Absolutely. None of the other revolutionary figures are, except for Cardenas. But they're absolutely the most famous, kind of most important figures of the revolution. Zapata and Villa. Yeah. And both were, you know, ultimately killed and assassinated by the Mexican government. But of course, in the kind of mindset of the revolution, they were both brought into the revolutionary story. You know, now they're buried in Mexico City in a pantheon next to the guys who killed them. So the revolution had to sort of like stamp out all these kind of regional ideas before it could become the basis of the nation. It's classic, yeah.
Joseph, tell the people what the president gave you when you left his home.
Oh, I got a couple books. Got a very nice party gift. Yeah, the big. Yeah, these two. Again, it's very interesting because. Sorry.
Gave you an art book of Diego Rivera.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, why? What is that? Anyhow, yeah, these two met in the home of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, who were the kind of very famous artists. You know, they were kind of leaders of the sort of, you know, cultural elite, and they were both in college. They met there, and again, you know, the next day I was speaking with my friends in Mexico. These are, you know, working class people. They live in Mexico City, and they didn't quite remember who Echeverria was, but they knew his wife. They knew Doña Maria, who is probably. She's definitely more, you know, beloved than her husband is, but I think she's even more famous to this day. And, you know, typical Mexican people don't follow politics like we do. There's nothing really inspirational about following politics. There's, you know, they kind of resign themselves to the fact that the government works for the government's interest. You know, Mexico's still a country where if you have a problem in the street, you don't go to the police. You go to your fellow citizen, because the police are seen very, very suspiciously, and they're often kind of the source of the problem. So politics and government are not seen as a kind of force of good. But they knew Doña Maria. They weren't quite sure who Echeverria was. But most people aren't reading the newspaper, keeping up with, you know, daily political chatter. Yeah, Marie?
Did Echeverria think that meeting with you would accomplish something for him? Did he think that you would be able to help him redeem his reputation in some way?
No, he was the meeting was arranged by a family friend, okay. And he was incredibly lucid. I mean, the guy walked in and he asked him about his daughter who was getting married the next day, and then funny story was that I get books. The former Attorney General does, but the friend of the family gets nothing. And it's because it turns out that when Echeverria asked him about his daughter's wedding, he was really embarrassed because he didn't invite them. So that's why he got nothing. So my friend said. But no, he's not. At this point, he's not really, trying to. He's not really doing any kind of propaganda or any kind of PR stuff. He's just very curious that some weird gringo wrote a book about him, and I gave him several copies. I signed it. I thought about that signature for a long time because that could backfire on me one day. But, yeah, it was just a friendly visit. Yeah, Joe.
Years since the revolution now, what's the relationship between the people and their government now and their election of their leaders?
Oh, well, let me put it this way. The Mexico that I studied then is a far cry from today. Things have gone sharp decline since then. Mexico in the mid-20th century was a model for third world development. It was a place where people were, the economy was booming, schools were being built, infrastructure was being built, there was political stability, and all of that's gone. It's gone now. Now, the Mexico of today is not. It's far less stable. There are swaths of the country that are under the control of drug cartels. There's the gap between rich and poor has reached pre-revolutionary levels. So it's unfortunate that Mexico is not, it can look back upon this time as being a much, much better and more stable and prosperous time than today.
Are they on the verge of a new revolution?
Possibly. There's guerrilla movements that have emerged in the southeast and the west. Most importantly to Mexico is the problem with the cartels. And maybe I could just leave you with this because this concept here is absolutely essential, clientelism. Because there's always been kind of vice networks in Mexico. For a long time there were cattle running networks. There were marijuana running networks. There were prostitution and gambling rings. And because of Mexico's proximity to the US, where all those things were illegal, you had these kind of organizations that emerged to provide those services to, gringos, who would go to the border to visit a prostitute, to gamble, to smoke marijuana, to buy illegal guns. So these vice networks developed in Mexico to provide the huge demand from the United States. And they were protected by the government. The PRI basically allowed them to operate in exchange for bribes. They created vice zones in the border in places like Tijuana, Juarez. But since the PRI lost power in 2000, all of those kind of vice networks have been made illegal. The government basically went to war with them. So the drug war begins exactly when the PRI loses power. And these client networks, which have been long in place since the revolution between the cartels and the government, are instantly severed, leading to the drug war. So that's kind of how you destabilize a country in a decade, by basically making these making these practices which have been allowed for a century all of a sudden illegal, and put them at odds with the army, which is what's happening. Hopefully the Mexican government wins the drug war, but it doesn't seem to be happening.
So what's the quality of life in Mexico? I mean, what are the people, what do they have? If you compare Southbridge to Mexico, what does it look like?
It's not even close. No, it's not even close. The standard of Mexico, again, by developing world countries, is a fairly, affluent country. But we're still talking about a place where a sugar worker in the Yucatan earns less than $3 an hour. I'm sorry, no, less than $3 a day. Not an hour. Yeah. So there's a reason why agricultural workers in Yucatan, in Jalisco, Guanajuato, are willing to kind of make this treacherous voyage across the border into the United States, where they can get paid $5 a box of cherries rather than $3 for a day of labor. So no, the standard of living is not even close, and it's dropping. It's dropping. Yes.
We have friends in Veracruz, so we've been to Córdoba, Veracruz twice, and shot North America. They have a shot in Mexico, and the workers there, they work all day for $6.
Yeah. What did they do?
They do, what is it that they do? Shot, it's fiber optics, so that's what they do. And they work all day for $6.
No. And that's relatively well paid.
Yes.
The agricultural sector is even worse. And again, all of the, I'm in Washington, where apples, cherries, hops. We just went to a Treehouse Brewery, and those hops come from Washington. Those hops are picked by Mexican workers. And again, the idea that those workers have snuck across the border, that they're illegal, that they're like, you know, breaking the law, they're welcomed at the border by growers who pick them up on buses and escort them to their plantations in Washington State. They live in barracks. You know, when the immigration controls come through, they're hidden. All of this is happening complicit with growers who rely upon Mexican workers. And this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that this is how we can go to the market and buy bananas for 60 cents. The real prices of bananas should be much, much higher if you had workplace protections, real wages paid, but we don't. So, but still, the alternative for those Mexican workers who leave their homes, give up their entire lives, you know, face death in the Sonora Desert as they cross the border, is poverty and unemployment and political corruption in their homeland. So it's it's kind of the real reality of the modern economy.
I'd like to thank Dr. Lenti this evening for coming here and giving us such an interesting overview on Mexico and giving us the historical perspective as well. I want to stop the talk now. I'm sorry, but I know there are people who have more questions, but we won't have time for the book signing if anybody would choose to be interested in having Dr. Lenti sign copies of the book. There are copies on the table, and if we can organize that pretty quickly, that would be great. And for anybody who's leaving, we have tons of food and libations here if anybody would like to imbibe on the way out. So,
thank you so much.
Thank you very much.